He's not Patrick?
No, he's not on.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Agent. Clegg.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Sanchez.
Here.
Thompson. Here. Woodings. Here. 5 present, 1 absent.
Thank you. So first up today, we have Haley Falconer, welcome,
Thank you.
to discuss emerging constituents in water and the water sampling of it.
Yes, Madam Mayor, council members, thank you for having us here today. We're here to talk about emerging constituents and water. Ties into our utility planning work, but we're here today and kind of the timing of it as a response to questions from Council President Clegg and Council Member Sanchez, where if there were anything that stood out or anything that we needed to be aware of as far as yellow flags. And the early analysis and kind of initial results that we've seen, we don't have anything to be that are raising those yellow flags. But what we want to do today is talk through what we're doing and what we've seen and kind of what's coming next. Stole my own agenda. So a little bit of background on emerging constituents. Wanted to touch on the existing programs that we have right now to target emerging constituents, and then really focus on what we've done and what the results we've seen to date. So when we talk about emerging constituents, we're talking about a variety of chemicals, pharmaceuticals and personal care products like soaps or shampoos, herbicides and pesticides that we may use in our yards, or things like caffeine in our coffee or sucralose in our Diet Coke. Those are all kind of a variety of things that show up or we talk about as emerging constituents. And most waters contain some number of and some quantity of emerging constituents. So that's a really important baseline. And they show up in the environment in a variety of ways. So they could be through that direct application of something like a pesticide or an herbicide, and then it runs off into the water system. Or often what we're talking about in water renewal is indirectly after we have our cup of coffee in the morning or take our prescription medicines. Those are consumed by people, and then they come to us through the water renewal system. And then some chemicals are also, they move through the environment through atmospheric transfer. But the complexity of this topic is certainly not lost on us, but is one that we wanted to kind of break down with those areas. And then we'll kind of really focus in on the water piece of this. So again, to kind of lead with the punchline, we have sampled in 6 different locations over the course of 2 different sampling events, and I'll talk through those details. But what we found is that there were emerging constituents measured in each of those different water bodies. But for the emerging constituents that have a health screening level, so a comparison that we can give to that is like the amount of caffeine you might consume in a day, and there's a comparison to that. The amount of the emerging constituents in our effluent are far less than that health screening level. And again, the initial results indicate that what we're seeing in our system are comparable to or less than other utilities. So wanted to lead with those topics as we dive into the details.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Haley, quick question about that, and if you're going to cover it later, you can save it till then. Just wondering what the concentration levels were above and below the plants and whether we noticed any noticeable, measurable difference.
Madam Mayor, Council President, I do have that data. I did not put those specifics in this presentation. So we did see some constituents that increased upstream to downstream. That'll really be part of the next analysis to say, okay, what does that mean? But none of it was, I guess, out of the ordinary. So we can bring that back in the kind of further analysis as well.
Thank you.
So this has come up in a variety of conversations, but wanted to just touch on a couple of our existing programs that relate to water quality in the water environment. So the first being stormwater. Why this is important is we might see things like oil and grease, or those herbicides and pesticides and fertilizer, or microplastics show up in the water environment in the river through stormwater. So those are typically not treated. It's a direct discharge into the river and an area of focus for pollution in the Boise River. But some of the things we're doing is we've had a long time on-site retention policy for stormwater. We are shifting towards or looking at green stormwater infrastructure and how we can disconnect those piped systems from the river. Our pretreatment program has been a long-standing, maybe even the longest standing in the state. We've got a team of 5 people whose job it is to connect with and regulate our industrial dischargers, whether the larger industries or smaller minor industries like restaurants and commercial businesses. But this is a Clean Water Act requirement, gives us the regulatory authority to set limits and to enforce those, really with the goal of keeping things out of our system. And this is really a primary focus for some key emerging constituents. Is as much as we can do outside of the fence really helps us with the treatment that we do inside the fence. And our household hazardous waste program is another solid program, a rock star program in our repertoire. And this is where things like paint and chemicals, those lawn products, anything that's labeled hazardous or flammable or caution, those should not be thrown in the trash and they should not be dumped down the toilet. And so we have a program set up to be able to divert those from both of those systems. And we are seeing an increased number of households that use those and an increased number of pounds diverted to those programs. We saw about 1.6 million pounds of waste diverted in 2019. And a subset of that program that really ties into this conversation is the pharmaceutical take-back program. So this is where we work with the medical community and with the different pharmacies and other communities. It's not a City of Boise only program. And we have dedicated drop boxes for pharmaceuticals, again, so they don't get flushed down the toilet and they don't get thrown in the trash. And in that program, about 8,000 pounds of pharmaceuticals were diverted last year. And if we imagine the small weight and size of a pill, that's a pretty tremendous amount of pharmaceuticals. And certainly none of those programs succeed without a robust community engagement. So continuing to talk with our community about the importance and the need for these, and then how to access them and what that looks like.
Madam Mayor. Thanks, TJ. Thank you. Thank you. That sounds awesome. I love that. Are we providing information about these options in multiple languages?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, I'm not sure off the top of my head, certainly something that we will add to our to-do list if we're not for all of them. We also connect with our new residents for our move-in and move-out and make sure they have that information as well, but certainly having them in another language would be appropriate.
Great, thank you.
And Madam Mayor, just a few quick questions. The stormwater, I've been hearing ads on the radio during commercials, listening to CNN. I hear, protect our stormwaters, you wouldn't sweep anything in them. Is that us running those? Do you know who's running those ads?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, there's some pet waste ones right now locally that we're running. So that's part of Partners for Clean Water, where we're one of the agencies as a part of that. So I'm not sure if they're specifically the same, but yes, that's a big piece of what we try to do is take a component of what goes into the stormwater that's a concern and really try to make that something folks can connect to. So
it's a team effort. Thank you. And then 2 other quick questions, probably easy ones. The ones where you put paint cans and you take them and have them disposed of appropriately. When the can's empty, you can still throw it in the trash?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, yes, if it's empty, that can go in the trash.
And then last question on the pharmaceuticals. Is it only collection of the actual pills, medicines, or because I have a dog that has diabetes and I collect quite a few of the needles and collect them in the Sharpie container. And when I first went to dispose of them, I couldn't find a pharmaceutical place to take them. Finally, a fire station did, out of the sweetness of their heart. But what's the best way to dispose of those?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, the Sharps, if they're in either a Sharps container or in a sturdy jug, like a detergent jug, those once sealed can go into the trash.
Oh, you can just throw them if
Yes.
they're so, okay. Very helpful, thanks.
Good question.
Madam Mayor, Just to follow up on the issue that Councilmember Thompson brought up, I don't know if my other council members have been contacted by folks who want to provide a more, an easier location, easier options for people to dispose of those sharps. Have you been contacted? Has Public Works been contacted at all about that?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, there have been some conversations specifically about sharps, and it is a concern that we see from a staff safety standpoint as well. But that has not been one that's been at the kind of front of the list or that we've been in detail involved in.
Madam Mayor. So Haley, the prescription give back program right now, if I look on the state side, it only lists a couple of pharmacies, and they're both related to hospitals, and others are other police departments, those kinds of things. Has there been any effort to get all pharmacies to take back?
Madam Mayor, Council President, not yet, but it's interesting in going through this, the importance of that, and also the messaging that pharmacists could also serve as a surrogate messenger for us and share the information about how to dispose of them. So there are a couple, one 24-hour location is a Walgreens on Fairview, and then I think Boise State has a location as well, but it is prohibitive from a location standpoint right now, and certainly an opportunity for expansion.
Yeah. Would sure seem like if we could get a program, you know, when you go pick up your new medicine, if you have something left, you could take it and drop it off. Seemed like that would be the easiest thing for most folks.
I agree. That's a great idea. I wanted to talk one success story about pretreatment, something that we can hopefully relate to. In 2012, in our NPDES discharge permit, we received mercury limits, very low mercury limits. And so through our pretreatment program, we worked with the Idaho Dental Association to implement what are mandatory best management practices for all dentists that are in our service area. So they have to provide dental amalgam, the mercury amalgam separators, so that mercury doesn't come into our system. There's mandatory reporting back to us. And through that process, we've seen a 50% reduction in the influent mercury to our system. And so this is really a tool that we have, and I equate it to something like energy efficiency or water conservation. This is our efficiency program for these things. We don't want any of this to come to our system, or we know it's going to, but how we can reduce it is really important, and pretreatment is a substantial tool for that. And the graphic shows one of our household hazardous waste brochures that we have to talk about the importance then also related to mercury of things like light bulbs or thermometers that should not be thrown away and should be properly disposed of. And just nationally, this topic is not something that we're only talking about here. It is a topic of national research, emerging constituents in all types of water, drinking water and recycled water. And it's something that through the sampling that we're doing that we'll talk about here, the city is proactively sampling and is really helping to augment that data set and that research and wanting to be a part of that. And like I mentioned, this is an issue that's facing every city and every community that has water renewal, certainly. I guess in some ways, the unique challenges that are associated with cities that have long-term industrial or chemical use, that's not something we see here, but that doesn't make it any less of a concern or an area of focus for us moving forward. So just wanted to talk through the public works sampling plan and why we did this with the real anchoring of having data that was ours, it was relevant here locally to Boise, and that we could use this sound science and data to inform decisions moving forward. So trying to answer some questions like which emerging constituents are we finding, in what water bodies, what levels, and then do those levels, kind of what risks do they pose? Are there any concerns here in Boise? I just want to stop and point out the picture real quick of the people that it takes to do this. You know, this is our staff in pretreatment, in sampling and monitoring and at the laboratory. And for them, each of these 3-day sampling, because of the very low levels of emerging constituents, they don't drink coffee, they don't shower for a few days beforehand. The residual of shampoo or soap or caffeine in their system could impact the results. And so the commitment that they're personally making to the data quality that we're receiving is pretty incredible. And then they're all really grateful when it's over and they can go back to their normal habits. So what we've completed is 3 sampling events in May, July, and September, trying to get that seasonal variation. The September sampling was just last week, so we will not be presenting that data. We don't have that back. For each of those sampling events, we went to 5 or 6 locations we sampled 3 different days each time. So in May on the Boise River, we'll have 3 data points for upstream of Lander Street. So trying to start to really build that data set. And then for each of those locations and points in time, we analyzed 308 different constituents. So to kind of frame the amount of data that we're building here. And where we did this was 2 locations on the river, upstream and downstream of Lander Street, an irrigation canal and an irrigation drain, and then the influent and effluent of Lander Street, and a groundwater source as well. So getting a variety of water bodies, a variety of sources. And as expected, we did see emerging constituents in each of those 6 locations in the sampling events. So we are seeing emerging constituents, but as a reminder, and I'll, kind of tied back to that health screening level, the effluent concentrations that we saw from Lander Street, which does not have filtration, and we are not producing recycled water right now. We have a secondary treatment process that we are not seeing levels at or near the health screening levels. We're far less than those by comparison. I'll share some data comparing our results to some other utilities. And we are achieving, I did not necessarily put the removal rates in this presentation just for the level of detail and time, but we are seeing some removal of constituents through our process. And in the future, as we shift to recycled water, potentially we would see additional treatment steps, we would add filtration, and we would anticipate even seeing further removal. But certainly there's further data collection and analysis that's required on this data.
Madam Mayor. Haley, it doesn't look like you sampled any of the potable water in the valley, given that it is upstream in the river and that some of our water is surface. It would make sense that it probably is there. Is that something we're planning to do in the next stage?
Madam Mayor, Council President, as far as us sampling it or working with Suez on their sampling, I do think that is something that we want to consider. They have done some initial sampling specifically for PFAS, and that's something that once we do have those results, that is something we can share, I think, as well. But certainly they, through the drinking water rules, have a number of constituents that they already sample for as their requirements, and so that's something that they have as well.
Thank you.
So there's a lot on this slide, and I'll try to simplify what we're looking at, but the results here, this is of the Lander Street effluent comparing us to other utilities that have a similar level of treatment. So across the bottom, we're showing the variety of constituents that were measured. Across the y-axis here is the concentration, and we are represented by the bars across here. So, and then the other utility in comparison are the dots. And ultimately, in the quick scan of this, we are at or below concentrations for comparable utilities. So I think this is a very good indicator. It's at least one data point for us to connect to. Again, when I look at this, I see one that stands out, this 4-nonylphenol, which is a lubricant, and it's something that is an interesting one there where we are notably higher than others. And it's an area where we'll further dig into that to try to understand why is that the case, what is that, what could be a source, and is that an area that we need to do further upstream work. And then, of course, we wanted to talk about PFAS today. So these are the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are in a range of things like firefighting foam and fast food containers, microwave popcorn, and waterproof jackets. It's really, they're everywhere. So we tested for 18 different PFAS constituents. And this graphic here is representing the influent and effluent of Lander Street. And so of those 18, 11 of them came back non-detect. We were not able to measure a quantity in the water. That's good news. And for the 6 that I'm showing here, where the blue bar is the influent, the green bar is the effluent. And I'm comparing here the kind of one regulatory marker that we have is the EPA drinking water health advisory level. So this is a health advisory level set by EPA based on lifetime exposure to PFAS for people, including people in sensitive populations. And so that's set at 70 nanograms per liter or 70 parts per trillion for PFAS plus PFOA. So again, this is drinking water, the assumption that we're drinking a certain amount of water every day. The effluent from Lander Street is coming in at less than 10 parts per trillion as a comparison to that level. So this is good news. It is not perfect, but I think in the realm of getting our first round of data, this is very good news in what we're seeing, and something certainly that we'll continue to add to this data set moving forward. So just a couple of more things, kind of next steps. This really is the first of a conversation and not the last. We'll continue with community education, and that can be, broad to our general public or really targeted to areas that we know are potentially sending us items. And then building on our pretreatment program, we anticipate building a mandatory best management practice for PFAS as well, because we know that is an area of concern and we want to be doing that. I've been listening to a few different trainings this week in the water industry, and that the emphasis on pretreatment is very strong, that we really, for PFAS and for these constituents, really focusing upstream as a starting point. And then continued sampling and analysis. We'll finish our sampling in February and then be able to do a really deep dive into the data that we have and come back with those results. And certainly committed to additional research, evaluation, understanding where we've got some of these question marks that we want to be able to answer further. And just as a kind of bringing it back to the utility plan, which is back here next week, and Steve mentioned this as the concept for a project and how we'll bring that back to Mayor and Council and what the community outreach will look like for that. This area of emerging constituents will come back into the policy conversation of what treatment levels should we be targeting and how do we balance that with affordability and what we're hearing from our community. And it's an even more important reason why we're collecting the data now, to be able to inform those conversations about specific projects moving forward. So that's really the tie-in to these two and part of why we're here today. And with that, I will stand for any further questions.
Madam Mayor. Thank you, Haley. I have to admit, my perception of all of this has radically changed over the past week. I had to cut my participation short in last week's meeting because shortly before our work session last week, I learned of a dear friend who'd passed away that morning from lung cancer. This friend of mine is the third of a family of 6 siblings to die since 2007 from cancer. Mexican, worked in the fields, family lived at a time for a period of time in Chicago in low-income housing, where they talked about having to sweep every day because of air pollutants that were coming into the home. And she's 53. Her sister died in 2011, also 53 years old. The Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs has an award named for Martha Torres as a humanitarian award. Their brother Oscar died in 2007, esophageal cancer moved to his stomach. Amazing people. All of this has real world consequences. And I think it's important that we recognize that the work that Public Works does in ensuring that we have safety in our community, there are people's lives attached to that, people who contribute at a high level to our community. And so thank you, and thank you to the rest of the staff at Public Works, who basically is doing life-saving work. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
I just may say thank you, and I'm really sorry for your loss as well.
Sure, Councilman Halliburton.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. And thank you for the presentation, Haley, and thank you, Councilmember Sanchez, for putting that context into place. Haley, I know you said that you tested one of the canal areas. Since we've been getting questions primarily about the Farmers Union Canal, would this represent similar to what people have concerns about in that area or other canals, or is this a very different canal that would have different testing results from the Farmers Union?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, great question. I think a little bit of both. So that's when I characterized a canal and a ditch or a drain, I guess, that there was to characterize two different areas. So in the canal, certainly the drain being an area that is still used for irrigation, but is also collecting a lot of that agricultural runoff in the process. So we will not necessarily compare those two results as we get them back. But I do think that the canal results are something that we can use as an indication for what we may see in other irrigation canals, and certainly an area of potential further analysis and evaluation. I think there are some things we didn't measure that we probably should have, like the bacteria concentrations and some of the metals. And so we were really focused on emerging constituents, and I think should have done a little bit more of that as well in all of the water bodies.
And Madam Mayor, just a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. And then I guess one more question would be, if we're testing at one spot in the canal, do we have the jurisdiction to test in a much further down location? Like if we're testing, right as it comes out of the river or right as it comes out of the Lander Street facility versus testing out in Eagle, can we tell that there's even more emerging constituents, 10, 15 miles down the road in the canal versus closer to the source?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, great question. I would say we would probably want to do that with some level of partnership or participation with any canal that we were testing in. But I think based on not just our data, but watershed data in other places, we would expect to see increases in concentrations as we move down that canal system.
Yeah, my curiosity there is just that when we get these emails and these concerns from people who potentially live out in Eagle or live out in Nampa, and what's happening between the facility where we're cleaning the water versus all the way to when it gets to there, and if their concerns actually have a lot more to do with potentially how people are using the land between those two areas. So that's the reasoning for that question. But thank you for your answers there.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Oh,
Sure. Councilmember Whittings.
Thank you. Hi, Haley. Did you find any concerning levels of pollution in any of the studies that you did, or was everything kind of under that EPA threshold?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember, right now, everything was under the health advisory levels. The PFAS is the only one that we have that health advisory level from EPA. The health kind of targets or standards compared to a daily intake of some similar component, we were less than all of those. I do think there are a couple that we'll want to evaluate further as we get the next rounds of data back, that we are seeing different upstream from downstream in the river, and just understanding kind of what those are, why they're there, and if it's a concern. But nothing that stood out as a yellow flag in any of this. Were very comparable to other utilities, and nothing that was maybe unexpected.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone who didn't shower for days so that they wouldn't taint the samples that they were taking. That's a pretty big commitment.
Agreed.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Haley, you didn't mention whether or not we've begun reviewing our discharge permits, but wonder if that's going to be part of what we'll do to see if we can identify those users where we might do some of those upstream intercepts on the influent.
Madam Mayor, Council President, so specifically to pretreatment.
Yeah.
So we have started kind of on our own, maybe a desktop exercise of where do we want to start and what does that look like, but building that best management practice or the program around that will involve some of that additional sampling at those targeted locations. And that's something that we can certainly learn from other areas in their pretreatment programs that have been doing this for the last year or so. So we have not started that yet, but using this work as the impetus to then go and start those conversations.
And then a follow-up to that, as going forward, as new industrial users and other users come on board, will we be changing the way that we look at our contracts with them so that we'll know going in what kinds of potential pretreatment we'd want to introduce?
Madam Mayor, Council President, yes. Today, I don't know that I can share the specifics of that for our contracts or permits that we have, but we've seen that. We've already been doing that for entities that are looking for a one-time discharge into our system and requiring additional sampling of, whether it's metals or emerging constituents, to make sure that we know what's coming in and whether or not we even can approve that or want to say yes to those. So those are things that we've already started doing. An example of that would be the landfill leachate, and having done that testing and then not allowing that into the system because of the emerging constituent risk. Those are things that we'll continue to evaluate, both for our contracted entities, but also for those one-time discharges.
Thank you. And one last question, if I could. So I know that there's some legacy PFAS that seem to be, at least the reading I've done about it, seem to be declining in the environment, but the new ones are being introduced all the time. Are we testing for those new ones? Are we testing the legacies? Are we testing both and for both? And as you go forward with this analysis, will you be looking for any differences in those?
Madam Mayor, Council President. So shortest answer is we are testing what I would say the older, the long chain. That's the PFAS and PFOA, and some of the newer short chain. I can't say off the top of my head whether we've tested some of the next gen chemicals. So I don't know that specifically without pulling that data up. But certainly that'll be part of, as we build this data set, understanding what's happening between the different types of PFAS specifically. And then are we seeing any trends that we can identify, maybe either what's happening outside of our system or within our system, to start targeting even further reductions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Yes.
Okay, next up we have Chief Lee to do some follow-up on policy, police policy. Is the chief? Oh, you're right here. I didn't see you walk in.
I try to be discreet.
You were like super sneaky.
Come on, work. Madam Mayor, member of council, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Again, this is the third and final in a series of presentations about the Boise Police Department designed to provide you some information. So for today, it worked. For today, we'll start out with a brief recap of the past presentations. Talk about a few other areas that council expressed concern of, assets that we may have, personal protective equipment, our approaches around warrants and warrant service, and then crowd management. And we'll talk specifically about those issues. So again, just as a brief recap, obviously we have a strong investment in community policing with the Boise Police Department. Part of how we're allocating the resources that we've been afforded in the upcoming year is to increase the size of the behavioral health response team. We'll be adding an officer and a clinician to meet that service need for the community. We'll also be developing the beginnings of a services coordination team to have a addiction side services coordinator as well as an officer working with that vulnerable population as well to help meet that service need. We provided information on use of force. In short, force usage in the city of Boise is markedly low when looked at by national standards. It's low when looked at by peer cities as well. In 2019, the number sort of speaks for itself. There's force even at the lowest levels to the higher levels of force. Force gets used once in every 1,378 contact events. So we also mentioned that there was policy review that's underway. Presently going through the entire policy manual, examining whether or not it's structured in a format that's digestible by the members of the Boise Police Department as well as the public. We're examining the benefit of restructuring as well as restructuring the way the policies themselves are actually presented. And as part of that restructure, ensuring that they comport with national best practices. And we're drawing from a sample size of both major cities, recognizing that we are a growing city, peer cities, and then regional policies, as well as looking at recommended national best practices from a variety of organizations. We've invested heavily in training, recognizing that training is the nesting ground of all things culture for our police department. We want to maintain a strong investment in a service leadership approach and one that's invested in community. So we are approaching from a services need. We have recognized the need to increase our training for responding to people in mental health crisis. I'm happy to say that this week we started the first of a series of trainings designed to get every sworn member of the Boise Police Department the 40 hours of crisis intervention training as a standard. That is generally viewed, again, as what most police departments offer to their officers that are in specialized crisis intervention teams. That will be the standard for every sworn member in our police department. We're also in the process of doing a training needs assessment, starting with the approach of assessing the needs from what the members feel they need most. The next phase will be assessing community input and using that training needs assessment to develop a training plan moving forwards into the future. That will be the first training plan that any of my staff at the Boise Police Department is aware that we've ever developed, looking at addressing those critical needs. And then lastly, I'll mention that we did talk about resources and resource time allocation. I will sum it up in that there's been a decrease in discretionary time for officers over the last decade. Discretionary time being the amount of time that they're free to engage in proactive policing, free to engage in non-enforcement activities, free to engage with the community, much the way the community wants and is a linchpin for community policing. We're examining if there's technologies we can leverage to buy back some of that time, how we can allocate resources, and how we can ensure that we continue with a community policing approach. So on to the new subjects. After the presentation on use of force, there were members of council that expressed an interest wanting to know about our officer-involved shootings. I'll sum it up by saying that the average in the last decade comes out to 1.7 officer-involved shootings per year. You can look at the graph and you can realize that there are clearly some years that are well outside the norm. The most frequently occurring is a single officer-involved shooting a year, not to make light of any exercise of deadly force on behalf of the police. We want to avoid those situations if all possible. If we were to take out the statistical outliers, those high years of 2016 and 17, we would be below our peer cities. With those, we're comparable to our peer cities.
Madam Mayor? Thank you, Chief Lee. Of these shootings, how many resulted in fatalities?
I would have to go back and do the research to look at that. I don't have that data point, but I'm happy to get it for you, ma'am.
Madam Mayor, just a follow-up to that, would we have the racial and ethnic background of the shooting victims?
We could go back and construct that. I don't have that data handy. One of the interesting byproducts I've discovered about our records management system is it's not designed to capture any what we would call racial data on anybody, whether you're the victim of a crime, whether you're a suspect, whether you're a recipient of a use of force. The system was not, when they designed it and implemented it, it was never designed to capture that. And so we're having to reconstruct that. It would require a little bit of time, but I can get you that information if you're interested, ma'am.
In fairness, Chief, we discovered that in the early days of COVID as well, that information was not being collected. So it's hopefully a trend that our community will change. Thank you.
I would agree with you. I think it's something that the community is vitally interested in, and we're working to build that infrastructure to capture it for, I'm sure, many of the reasons you're thinking, ma'am. Talking about personal protective equipment and the assets that we have on hand, I'll lead by saying that military surplus equipment, what's generally referred to as equipment acquired under the 1033 program, I did an inventory shortly after arriving. We did have assets that we had acquired from the 1033 program. We have divested ourselves of all of that, returned it to the Idaho State Police to return back. There was no need for us to have that equipment. It had been sitting in an armory unused. It hadn't been used for years. even if it had utility, I don't know that we need to have it in the city of Boise. So gone through the process of returning it. It should be, if not already in the possession of ISP, it should be shortly in the possession of ISP. Speaking more specifically, though, to some of the other items that draw concern is, we do have a Linco Bearcat. It is an armored vehicle. I want to specifically point out that it's an armored vehicle designed for police work. It's not one that was ever designed for other types of work. It is a piece of personal protective equipment. It affords us the opportunity to have both time and distance in a safe location from which we can negotiate with and respond to potentially lethal threats. Along those lines, we work with Ada County to have a second piece of personal protective equipment or an armored vehicle that's designed to be, frankly, what I think most people think of as an armored ambulance, so that we can get into situations where there is a deadly threat and still provide medical aid to people that may be injured in that environment. Similarly, we do have patrol canines that we use as the ability. We can send them downrange to apprehend individuals if necessary, without necessarily having to expose officers to a potentially dangerous or deadly threat, or to go into uncleared spaces that present a risk for the officers involved. We do have distraction devices, or what are colloquially referred to as flashbangs. They're used by our Special Operations Unit or SWAT team. They're designed purely for the purpose of buying back time. They're designed to essentially startle the senses of an individual that we have to physically address, so that we reduce the likelihood of having to use deadly force, so that we have time and distance to our advantage to be able to close that ground and apprehend somebody if necessary. Along the lines of personal protective equipment, I think it's important to recognize that there are actually OSHA regulations that govern some of the personal protective equipment that police officers have to have. I think when we think of OSHA and we think of PPE, people think of people from public works that may be working in an environment where they need, protective equipment from whatever they may be exposed to, whether that's a respirator, whether that's, some sort of hazmat suit, whether that's construction grade equipment. We operate in a slightly different environment, and we do recognize that we have to be able to, by OSHA standards, provide PPE to address the threats and hazards of our environment. To sort of point that out, beyond the obvious stuff that we may have, such as nitrile gloves or face masks in the time of the pandemic, or even outside of the time of the pandemic, to address the public and keep our officers healthy and safe, we also have a very real need to wear ballistic armor. Case in point. I think the best way to illustrate that would be to tell the story of Officer Jordan McCarthy in 2016. Officer McCarthy responded to a call of shots fired and that there was a victim who was down. He responded to the area, could see that there was a victim who was down, and could see another person some 70 yards away, and couldn't assess whether or not the person was the threat, the shooter, or whether or not it was another victim. And he took a position of cover behind a truck and started to call out. What he didn't realize is that was indeed the shooter, who began to open fire and fired a series of about 10 rounds towards Officer McCarthy with a high-powered .308 rifle. One of those rounds penetrated completely through the vehicle, struck Officer McCarthy dead center in the chest. Fortunately, Officer McCarthy, of his own volition, had gone out and bought a hard ballistic plate for his chest. That rifle round, despite having gone through a vehicle, went completely through the hard armor. The soft armor stopped it. Fortunately, he only suffered blunt trauma. It would be akin to taking a fastball to the chest. We were able to medevac him out of the area, get him treatment, and he recovered from that. Based off of that lesson learned, it's now standard issued equipment to every officer in the Boise Police Department to have a ballistic for rifle rated, because that's the reality of the threat environment that the police officers in this city have to work in.
Madam Mayor, thank you for describing that. It helps me to understand these things better when there's a little bit of storytelling to it. So I appreciate that. The weapon that was discharged in downtown, I know that predates your time here, but it was this summer. The level of damage that type of ammunition would have caused, how does that compare to the weapon that you're describing, Chief?
It would be a smaller caliber weapon, but it would still be a rifle if the information I have about the event is correct. I think it's important to understand there's differences in ammunition caliber size, but the bottom line is that any gunfire is incredibly dangerous.
Thank you, Chief.
I'd also like to mention that there are government ratings for body armors. The National Institute for Justice does make an assessment and rate body armors. They continue to rate that as well as other personal protective equipment. They're continuing to develop standards for other challenges. The body armor is not simply the ballistic chest protector, but that would include the helmets that you see officers wearing. They're not just designed to protect them from blunt impact. They're also designed to protect them from gunfire, which unfortunately is a very real threat in the city that we work in. It's important that we, as the Boise Police Department, valuing the most important asset that we have, which are our people, is that we are constantly reevaluating whether or not we are affording them the best protection and what is appropriate by not just OSHA standards, but for the threats that we're starting to see out there in the community. We're continuing to assess whether or not the body armor that we buy for our officers and the equipment that we have is necessarily the best for the environment that they're in.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Chief, do we have data on the use of, not the body armor, but all of the stuff on the slide before, the use of the Bearcat, the use of the robots, the kinds of incidents where we do use them, how they're, the stories behind that, if you will.
So the Bearcat would generally be deployed by what most people would just refer to as their SWAT team. Rough numbers going off of memory, because I don't have the notes here, there was about 12 deployments in 2019. In other words, there were 12 events that the SWAT team responded to where that was an appropriate piece of protective equipment for them to be dealing with the individual from. In regards to how often we would use the robot, it would really depend. We're responding to what we perceive. Before you would send a robot downrange, you have what you perceive is there's a decent probability that that is an explosive device. The robot does afford us, again, this concept of time and distance. We can evacuate an area, send the robot downrange to look at the device. I'd much rather lose a small or a large robot, despite the thousands of dollars, than suffer the loss of an officer, the loss of a citizen, or having either of those people permanently maimed. I would have to look at the data of how often we're actually deploying the robot, but it goes out anytime EOD responds. It wasn't but more than probably about a month ago that EOD was down within blocks of here responding to what was a suspicious device that they believe might have been a legitimate bomb. So deploys fairly, I don't want to say fairly frequently. That is not a common threat, but it is not necessarily an uncommon one. And as the city grows, unfortunately, if we look at other cities as an example, the likelihood to have that type of equipment utilized more for the community safety will increase.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just follow up. I asked that question because I do think it helps citizens understand the need to have those if they understand when and how they're being used. So to the extent that we're going to change the way that we gather our information and disperse it, distribute it back out to the public, that might be one place that we would look at.
I appreciate that recommendation. I can make sure that we're capturing that information for you.
Thank you.
In regards to warrant services, I will very candidly say that that has become a topic of much conversation in the United States lately. And I think that it's important before, really before we talk about how a warrant is serviced, that we understand that a warrant is fundamentally an order from a judge. It's either an order to search a location, or it's in order for us to effect the arrest of an individual. A judge has reviewed it and deemed that there's probable cause and given a command to any law enforcement officer within the judge's jurisdiction to carry forth and do that. There are a variety of different ways that search warrants can be served. What's considered the national best practice under ideal circumstances is to do what's known as a contain and call out, with the terminology as a limited penetration of the home. And essentially, you're going to break down a door or something else, fall back to a position and try and call somebody out. The idea behind that is that you're denying the sense that they can bunker in the safety inside the house, and they're much more likely to negotiate and come out through negotiations without a forced intervention. You can also serve a search warrant via dynamic entry, although that is a very rare occasion that you would do that. Generally speaking, The only reason that you need to do that would be if there was a hostage rescue type situation or there was an active shooter. The last type of service generally in these broad categories that you'll hear people talk about is a no-knock search warrant, which would be essentially where you're entering into the residence and not announcing your presence prior to enter it. By policy that exists in the Boise Police Department, a no-knock search warrant could be authorized if the chief of police approves it. I will very candidly sit here in front of council and tell you, I cannot imagine a circumstance where that is the appropriate technique for service. Although, having said that, there's always some strange fact pattern somebody may present to me at some day that is a logical conclusion, but I cannot envision a circumstance where a true no-knock warrant makes sense. And I think there's a very, very limited slice of time where a search warrant served via dynamic entry makes sense. I think we should be sticking with what is the national best standard, which is the general trend of looking at how they have served warrants. That is the general trend that SOU is gravitating towards. That has been my direction to them to change that practice.
Madam Mayor. So Chief, is there a possibility that we could incorporate a policy that there be no knock warrants for BPD?
Functionally, that policy exists now because the only way you can execute one is with the authorization of the chief of police. Again, I can't envision a circumstance where I would be authorizing it, but there are always those strange fact patterns we may be presented with. I would be willing to, as part of this overall examination of what is best practice, and as we examine the policies, that is definitely on the list of things that we want to look at.
I think in light of what we've seen with the young woman.
Breonna Taylor.
Yes.
I would agree, ma'am.
That I think it's something that we should seriously consider,
No,
especially is the way you're conveying it, that the need for something like that is so rare, we should probably just make it policy.
I understand your point. And I understand the public's concern, ma'am.
Madam Mayor, if I could follow up on that point, I appreciate your willingness to look at simply getting rid of that as a practice. Isn't it also true that even if the chief says, yes, I would authorize a no-knock warrant, that still has to go before a judge, and the judge also has to authorize it as a no-knock?
That is correct. So anytime that we're serving a search warrant, if you wanted special exemptions to do a no-knock, you would have to present a pattern of facts and circumstances which would get a judge to agree that that is in the interest of what is most safe for the service of that warrant. To that end, the judge does have say in whether or not we would execute a search warrant outside of what they consider normal hours, which are generally viewed as sort of the 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. kind of banker hours, if you'll have it. If we're going to serve a search warrant very early in the morning, very late at night, that again would require a judge's approval for service outside of normal hours.
Madam Mayor, have we ever issued one of those no-knock warrants in Boise, to your knowledge?
They have been in the past, yes.
Madam Mayor, follow up to that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Do we have data on how many no-knock warrants have been issued in Ada County in the last decade?
I would have to talk to the prosecutor's office to try and figure out what that number is for Ada County. I think it would be useful for us if I can get that data to tease that apart by departments to understand what is the practice. Because again, you may have a search warrant for, we could have a desire to seek a suspect that's in, say, Meridian or Eagle. We would have the warrant whether or not we were servicing to that standard, what were all the exemptions. And so I would need to check some of that data to make sure it was actually reflective of what department was doing that.
It just might be helpful as we review this policy to understand the totality of it. Thank you.
The last subject we'll talk about is public order policing. For those unfamiliar with the term, it's what generally people would think of as crowd management or crowd control. There is no policy that governs crowd management or crowd control for the Boise Police Department's specific policy addressing that. There is a draft policy. There's a draft policy that is undergoing initial review right now in the department. It is very heavily emphasized that it is a management philosophy, with control being only an option if necessary, that management is always the preferred approach to dealing with an event. I think we've seen a management philosophy in the last few events out here that have responded well, that there's officer presence, that by mere presence, they try and facilitate people's lawful rights when they recognize that there are those individuals that want to engage in criminal activity. There's selective enforcement to address the criminal activity that they can interdict in a safe manner, and that crowd control is really an option of, for lack of a better way of describing it, an option of last resort for dealing with a large group of individuals. There really is not an oddity in a city our size or even a city larger not having a specific policy related to public order policing. That is an area, for whatever reason, that American policing has not addressed with much effort. There are a few places where you'll see more frequent protest activity, civil unrest, and civil disturbances that are occurring. You'll see that those departments have crafted policies, but it is not common to see them throughout the United States. It's just an area that's not there. So it is a little bit difficult to find other policies to compare this to that are US policies. There are a fair amount of policies related to other countries. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the United Kingdom, Germany, for example, all have policies that govern, but we have to look at how well they comport with American law to be able to translate in what is best practice there. I think what's important to understand, though, about the need for crowd management and crowd control and a public order policy in general is that we're in a growing city, as we've discussed many times. We're seeing a time in American history with increasingly divergent political views, and why we want to ensure that people can exercise their First Amendment rights. We also want to ensure that it's done peacefully and that they're not interfering with other people's rights as they go about doing it. I think it's important to understand that the number and size of these events here in the Treasure Valley, but particularly in our capital city here, is increasing. When I look at historically from the information that's captured versus what we've seen even since I was sworn in, pretty substantial increase in that type of activity. I'd also like to make sure the council understands it is incredibly resource intensive, both in time planning ahead of the event, the actual operation of the event, and it can be so resource draining just to ensure that those events are peaceful, that we essentially have minimal capability to respond to other policing needs in the city. And we are relying upon our partners in the Treasure Valley to often pick up that slack that we create by responding to these events.
Just a couple things on that. I think it's really important to note that, we were very intentional in your planning in the approach that the city took once you were sworn in to ensuring that we maintained order while allowing people the right to assemble and to speak. And other cities that have those policies often create them after they've experienced what we want to make sure we don't experience. So I think it's really important that not only do we have a policy about crowd control and the steps that would be taken if things are elevated, but have it institutionalized how it is that we will protect safety, protect the public, and protect folks that are there with divergent views, exercising their First Amendment rights, to ensure that we can prevent the violence that we've seen in other places from occurring here. And I believe if we can institutionalize that and we do it right, it is resource heavy. And I really appreciate the partnerships and the agencies that came to support the Boise Police this summer. Then we've done as much as possible to discourage and dissuade those who might decide to come into this community to try to reenact what they've seen in other places to doing that. And so it's a resource that I think is important. But like traffic and road engineering, you don't engineer for rush hour. You figure out how you deal with the resource intensive moments and partnership, and you have the supplies you need, recognizing that those ideally would be few and far between. And typically we're going about our community policing business.
I would agree, Madam Mayor. The last thing that I would mention about public order related policing is that if we unfortunately find ourselves in a very large and or contentious event, the personal protective equipment that the officers presently have is frankly inadequate for that environment. There are more discrete types of personal protective equipment. I have the police department conducting research to see if if we can indeed acquire something that is not as visually objectionable to some people, but would still afford protection for the officers. But there's a very real need to make sure that if they are operating in that environment, that I can do it with a reasonable expectation that they will be physically safe in doing it. And so that is, in the initial overview of this department, there is clearly a technology gap there and a resource need. And so we're actively looking at trying to find a solution for that, as well as I've got a conversation later this week with people to bring in management specific training for public order policing from an international perspective as to what is best practice to help arm our people with better information so that we can hopefully continue to have successful outcomes here in our city. And with that, I would open the floor to any general questions I may not have addressed in any of these three presentations, or anything that you would like me to follow up on and bring back to you at a later date.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilmember Halliburton.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Lee. I'm trying to figure out exactly how to ask this question, and I don't quite know how to do it. It has to do with this public order policing, because I don't pretend to understand how to know to control that type of environment, how to de-escalate things. And I think that there is policy that's related to, those types of growing protests. I guess my question is, how do you do that during COVID when there's a whole nother layer of policy on top of it? So when we've got when we're talking about, danger or putting people at risk, and you've got groups of people who are showing up and not practicing, some of the mandates that we have in place, like mask and social distancing, how does that layer into it? And have we seen any cities who have established new policies because of the protesting? And I guess it all relates back to a couple of the protests that I've seen where people have showed up to peaceful protests wearing a mask. Somebody comes up, gets in their face during a pandemic, during rising numbers, and is inches away and is clearly violating that space and a mandate that we have in place. And how do you, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, how do you create policy around that so that you keep people safe in those circumstances when a pandemic could be viewed as a deadly weapon if somebody's getting that close and breathing on you? That's why I don't know quite how to ask this question. I don't know how to put it into words, but I know that there's this just extra layer of complication going on right now that I don't see that we've enforced. And I saw somewhere, I think it was in northern Idaho, for the first time issue some citations to people that were protesting and not practicing safe protocol.
No, I think I understand
And I'm going to ask, just not to avoid the question, but we have 2 items on executive session. So you're going to need to do a succinct and maybe follow up with more information.
No, I would be happy to follow up with more information. I think to your point, council member, it's always a challenge for the police in dealing with these events. And we have to have an immediacy of the danger and a priority of safety in mind as we address those issues. But I'd be happy to set an appointment separately to talk to you about this more, sir.
Sure, thank you.
Madam Mayor, could I ask one quick question? Chief, we have the SRO contracts on our resolution calendar tonight. You and I have talked about the need to gather data about how effective that program is. Could you tell us what you're planning to do as these contracts are executed this year in terms of gathering data?
I just had a meeting with the SRO sergeants and the lieutenant that supervises that unit. We're building a database with an application that will be accessible so that we can track the number of calls, the number of hours they're spent, as well as how often we're getting into formal and informal diversion, particularly when we start to talk about certain at-risk youth categories with generalized demographics so as not to create a record. I'd be happy to talk to you about that more in depth separately, Council President.
Thank you. I just thought since it was on our agenda.
No, we're actively making the effort to capture that data so that we can show the value of the program to the whole community.
Great. All right, Madam Mayor, with that, I would move that we go into executive session. Personnel, land acquisition, Idaho Code 74206A and C.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Woodings,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Thompson. All in favor, motion carries.